I am 38. I was born in New York, and I'm an American of Eritrean descent.
And then what's your ethnic background in Eritrea? Like, what's your...
Tigrinya speaker.
Okay. But Tigrinya speaker or Tigrinya group? Because, like, that could be either.
Tigrinya speaker. Tigrinya speaking people, yeah.
Interesting. Why do you say Tigrinya speaking people?
Because we never say like we're Tigrinya. We say we're Eritrean. So I would never say I'm Tigrinya.
But like
never in my life have I said I'm Tigrinya.
Never?
No. I'm not saying I'm not part of that group. I'm just saying I would never say I'm Tigrinya. The way you ask the question, you're like, what am I? I'm like,
yeah, why? Okay, so then why wouldn't you say you're Tigrinya?
Because that's not language I've ever heard anyone say. I've never heard anyone say I'm Tigrinya ever in my entire life.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. We always just say we're Eritrean. Maybe that's, like, as the majority ethnic group, that's maybe part of the reason why, but yeah, it's just not something anyone I've ever known has ever said.
Okay. Do you identify with the word Habesha?
No. Well, identify is, what do you mean identify? Do I use it to describe myself? No. I understand that people project that term onto me, but I don't use it to identify myself.
So if you ask people, like if you were to see a group of like Eritrean or Ethiopian looking people, how would you ask them to identify themselves? Like,
are you Eritrean or Ethiopian? I mean, like, I know, like, literally like 5 minutes ago, I said that with you, like, you know, the kapsha, but that's just because I was like being lazy. I almost never use the word, to be honest. I would just say Eritrean Ethiopian.
So then what does the term Habesha mean to you?
The way I was introduced to the word, it was as if people were using it to describe Eritreans and Ethiopians. But as I grew older, I realized that they were only describing certain types of Eritreans and Ethiopians, while using the term to sort of implicitly efface the diversity of the entire region or both countries. So they would simultaneously use Habesha to talk about all Eritreans and Ethiopians, even though Habesha specifically referred to only like 4 ethnic groups. As someone who was born in the diaspora, like most of my cultural knowledge is what I got from my parents and my family members. And so even whether the things I got from them are true or not, the sort of belief amongst the people who I was most intimately around was that Habesha referred to Tigrinya, Tigray, and Amharic speaking peoples. So that would comprise 4 ethnic groups across the 2 countries, Tigrinya and Eritrea, Tigray and Eritrea, Tigrayan in Ethiopia, and Amhara in Ethiopia. Maybe it's not only Amharas, but people who speak Amharic in Ethiopia as like one of their primary languages. As I learned much later on in life, you know, that's not the entirety of both countries, so it doesn't make sense to use the term when you're speaking of both countries when, you know, that's only 4 ethnic groups out of, I mean, how many ethnic groups are in Ethiopia? 60 to 70? Eritrea has 9, so it's like we're literally discounting 98% of the ethnic groups who, you know, would probably have a more problematic association with the word. So that's a long-winded way of me saying I don't feel connected with the word because I think it's problematic.
Its meaning to you is like, you know, it's intended to describe all Eritreans and Ethiopians, but you don't believe it does that, essentially.
I don't believe it can do that because there are non-Tigrinya and Amharic and Tigray-speaking peoples who don't feel a connection to the word and actively are against the word. I mean, even amongst Tigrinya-speaking people, you know, there are contentions with the word Habesha because historically it's associated with like the Aksumite kingdom and ideas of like Abyssinia, which is associated with Christianity. And I've also heard about, I think like technically, again, all of this is from like cultural knowledge that's been passed down to me, so it might not be actually accurate. I haven't done like a extensive study about this, but Tigray people are included within the term Habesha, even though they're majority Muslim. But many Tigray people who I know don't feel connection to the word and fight against it, even though it like might be something that is projected onto them. I think it's sometimes similar to like Latinidad or like Arabness, where it's like someone might say like, oh, like you're from this country, so therefore you're a Latino, but someone from one of those countries could be like, no, I don't identify with Latinidad as a political project. Maybe because they're, you know, African descent, or maybe because they're indigenous. And then the same thing goes with, in the Arab case, with like, you know, Amazigh people or people in North Africa who maybe feel a contestation with like this pan identity that takes over. Eritrean was like my like sort of prominent identity. growing up, I always felt connection to Ethiopians as well, to be honest, because I was like the only African person in my entire class, and I knew we had a similar cultural background, but that wasn't based around the idea of like being Habesha. It was based around, okay, like we come from these two countries that are like right next to each other, and there's a lot of commonality. And so also for me, when I was younger, my family told me that Habesha like literally meant half caste, whether it was in Arabic or a sort of pre-Arabic language that was used in southern Arabia. Like that was the terminology that people from Yemen, what's present day Yemen and Saudi Arabia, would refer to how we now identify ourselves. So I also didn't like it for that reason. I'm like, well, why would I refer to myself as a half caste? Like that literally is like decentering my own identity, you know, and putting it from someone else who would view us as, you know, like a mutt or whatever, like you want to look at. People have different ideas about the history and around the etymology of the word and like where it actually comes from, but that's what I was always told. Also, if you want me to like answer shorter, just tell me. 'Cause I can just like
that was great. There's just like a lot to dig into, and I think especially I've never heard of Tigray and Eritrea being referred to as Habesha.
Okay.
I haven't heard that before, so that was interesting.
So like Habesha, like it's normally like associated with the Semitic language speaking peoples, and so Tigray is a Semitic language as well. So even though they're not Christian, from the way I've always understood it, is that they're technically Habesha. But again, like this is like conversations from Tigrinya speaking people who were like born before the 1950s telling me like what Habesha has meant. So language and identity is dynamic, and it's not a static thing. You know, it changes over time. So just because it's like dinner time conversations. There was like a Facebook discussion around this, like when Facebook first started, like 2000, or in the early days of Facebook, like 2006, in the Eritrea-Ethiopia Facebook group. So I remember everyone just had like different opinions on it. It was hilarious. Using Habesha to describe the peoples of like this region and what became of that kingdom, I know came from Southern Arabia. So it's like the term, as far as I know, is not something that originated within what's present day Eritrea and Ethiopia. It originated from Southern Arabia, and then like it became almost like de facto nome of the people. I think the way they refer to like our region, which is that it's like a mix of like Cushitic and Semitic peoples. And so like that's why they're called half castes. My family definitely uses it because it's like it's very easy. You know, it's like for simplicity's sake, it's easy even if we know the problematic nature of it. But I think generally, like, you know, at least amongst my family, there's an understanding that, okay, like, you know, not only like would the Oromo people not be considered Habesha, but like also, as far as we know, like Oromo people don't want to be considered Habesha. Like, and you can sort of use that sort of understanding for almost all, in quotes, non-Habesha ethnic groups. So for us, I think the only problem is when we use the term to describe like the entirety of both countries. But again, I think we use that just for simplicity's sake. I mean, even in New York, like what's our group listserv called? New York City Habeshas.
Yeah.
Like there are I know tons of non-Habesha people on that listserv who are Eritrean or Ethiopian. But it's like, you know, it's just what people do for simplicity. And also, I think some people also just don't know, to be honest. But like, I think in general, it's for simplicity.
I think that's what like is driving my project. Is like, is it simple though? Because people are clearly not satisfied with it. So.
Oh yeah. No, I mean simple in the sense that like, it's easy to just continue what we've been doing for decades or hundreds of years, rather than do the necessary work to make our language reflect the diversity and what should be the inclusivity of the nations we hope to have. But it doesn't reflect that. And the fact that we're not necessarily like willing to make those changes usually is either reflective of one's own privilege or, you know, one's lack of desire to make the necessary changes for, I guess, better social cohesion between peoples. Because identity is just constructed, and it's like it's the way in which identity becomes salient and becomes sometimes minimized or expressed, and all of it is like relative to different social dynamics that again like are constantly changing. And usually there's political or financial sort of pressure or incentive for why identities like sort of manifest in different ways. Like I think about like the history of like Latinidad in this country like a lot, because it's just like very fascinating. You know, like it's a term that similar to Habesha, did not originate within the region of which the people that are described as that term are from. Like the idea of being Latino started in the United States, which is like interesting, right? And like, so similar to me, like the same way, like Habesha is like not from, as far as I know, Eritrea and Ethiopia, but it's like now the term all of us use to describe ourselves.
The term didn't come from Spain?
So whether like how the term existed is one thing, but like how people came to see themselves as part of this group, it does not exist in Iberia or in the Americas. It existed in the United States. I bring up this example not because it's not super relevant obviously in the Eritrea case, but it's relevant in the sense that like if you ask someone like what a Latino person was in 1960, no one would have answered. They had no idea what you were talking about. Not only would they have no idea what you were talking about, no one would have identified themselves as that way. Like if you came to New York, like people would have said like they were Puerto Rican or they would have said they were Mexican. Like no one would have said they were Latino. But now if you ask it, the vast majority of people will probably say Latino, maybe they'd say Hispanic, maybe some percentage would just say their national country. But things change, and it changed, again, because there are political entrepreneurs who had things to gain from that existing. Identity is just a social construction, and like we have to be able to disentangle why we deem certain linkages amongst ourselves as more valuable and innate at certain times versus like before. The example with Tigray is like one that we could look at now. Like there's legitimate reason why someone from Tigray would feel less connected to the Ethiopian state now than maybe 20 years ago. And so how that will manifest 30 years from now is something that we maybe can't predict, but like the whole point of it is that just like how people identify doesn't stay the same, and doesn't stay the same because there are forces all around us that are influencing that. So yes, I think about identity, but like identity is not, I don't see it as like a real, it's not like real, like I recognize it's real because we exist in it, but it's not something that it's like biological. It's not something that's natural. It's like we're a product of our environment and our society. So yeah.
I think it's interesting because you answer on a more theoretical level, which makes sense because you're more academic focused.
You talking about them like the other people you've asked? Oh.
They do like very deeply personal, but like they also, it seems like a lot of people tend to use it. So it's also interesting to hear why you don't use it.
Yeah.
But then like, I don't know, even though you're adamant about saying you don't use it, you like clearly do use it because sometimes. I think it seems like, at least from my experience, you're kind of forced to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah. However, I feel like when, at least a lot of the Eritreans I've spoken to, when they're asked if they're Habesha, they'll say, like I noticed naturally they all followed up with, yes, I'm Eritrean.
That's always what I would say.
Yeah, like you always have to add that, which I think is interesting too, because that's the implication that you're Ethiopian, like that you're part of Abyssinia.
But I didn't grow up in DC, so I never had, that wasn't like my experience. It wasn't my experience that people were assuming I was Ethiopian.
So then I guess like how did you get introduced to the word? Do you remember?
Family. Like in our house, like we just discussed things, I don't know. Just came up.
Yeah, I guess that would make sense. Why you don't use it as often then, because you weren't around it seems like you weren't around a lot of other Eritreans and Ethiopians growing up.
Yeah, unless like besides the New York Eritrean community, yeah. But actually, coincidentally, my neighbors were Ethiopian, but besides them, there were like none.
But then also you mentioned that the Tigray people are like considered Habesha despite the fact that they're Muslim, which also it seems like
the Tigray?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It seems like you understand the word to have like a Christian implication as well. Mm-hmm. Can you talk more about that?
That's the thing, like there are multiple definitions that I know. So like I feel like one definition that I had heard growing up was about it being the Semitic language speaking peoples of our region, which like obviously crosses religious difference. But I've also heard it, at least initially, being applied to the sort of like Abyssinian kingdom, which obviously is associated with Christianity. I think those are somewhat more like intellectual exercises. Like in my family, people spoke about it as like, okay, like they were like, okay, these are the Habesha peoples. And they would like list out like, okay, like what I had listed out before, like Tigray, the Tigrayan people in Ethiopian and Amhara people. But the way people would use Habesha, they would use it to describe all Eritreans and Ethiopians. So not necessarily in my family, but just like how people would use it. So that's really what I had contention with, and that's how I saw it being used. It wasn't like, besides family conversations, when someone said Habesha, they weren't like they would use Habesha to describe a Kunama person. Like, you know, like they would ask, like, even there used to be pages, like something like they would literally say like, oh, like Afar person in, you know, Ethiopia. And it's like, okay, like that person is technically not Habesha. I don't think they probably wouldn't want to be, maybe they would, but as far as from what I would imagine, I don't think they would want to be associated with being Habesha. But yet here we have a page who's just like putting it out there because their thought process is that it's for all Eritreans and Ethiopians. I'm not calling for something where it's like, oh, don't include those people on your pages. My issue is like, well, you can represent someone who's Eritrean or Ethiopian without projecting this, what they might feel is a misidentifier to them. A lot of times, like what the arguments that people who are defenders of these terms, because again, it comes up in like lots of different cultural contexts, not just Eritrean Ethiopian, but they'll just say like, oh, like anyone can be Habesha. It doesn't have to be restricted. But like, that's not the point. The point isn't to like, the point isn't to make inclusivity in what was a restrictive and problematic term. The point is to use language that respects everyone's difference and doesn't make people have to feel like they have to force themselves into like the majority ethnic group's language. So that's my issues with it.
And then you said you know a lot of like non-Habesha Eritreans and Ethiopians.
I know some. A lot is maybe too much language that I use, but like I know some.
Okay, so then how, like, have you guys talked about this word? And if so, like, what have your conversations been like?
The people who I've spoken to around it don't feel a connection to Habesha. There were two people who there was at like it was a Seeds of Africa event, and like I was talking about like, and they're Oromo, and I was talking about like the New York City Habesha's listserv name, and they were like, oh yeah, like it's stupid, but it's like just for them it's just like, oh, like, you know, at the end of the day we're Ethiopian, or like we're Oromo, like we're Ethiopian, and so like this is just the group that we're part of, but like no, we don't. I don't consider myself to be Habesha, even though I'm part of the group, like the listserv. So
it seems like in recent years, obviously, I think for a number of reasons, both here and overseas, Africans are just more aware of this Habesha identity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, like, have you seen that in your friendships with Africans, and if so, like, how has that showed up?
Maybe because I'm older, I don't feel that I've seen a change in like in how that's happened. So that might be just because of like the nature in which like I'm going out into different spaces and interacting with people. For the most part, I'm just like interacting with the same people I've been for like the last 20 years, like give or take, whatever. So I don't necessarily see that change. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but I guess back in the day, another African person would use Habesha almost in a way to like show that they know the nuances of like the region. It's like, oh, they're using a word that like comes from our part of the world, which like if they were using that, obviously it shows more knowledge than someone not using it, even if it's something that I don't necessarily feel a connection. So yeah, that's how I've normally seen it like come up. Like people just like, oh, like, are you Habesha? And then they just like just go off about how much they know about Eritrea, Ethiopia. How do I feel about that? I don't feel any type of way about that. They're not from the region, so the fact that they even know it sometimes is, I'm just like, oh, interesting.
Would you say like there's any animosity that you've experienced as an Eritrean from other Africans?
Personally? No, never. Online you see things. Like you see like these stupid diaspora wars and whatever, and like you have, even within the Eritrean context, you can see anti-blackness and anti-Africanness like present within certain members of your family, or even though they would never not, at least I've never seen someone they themselves not identify as African, but that doesn't mean they still won't have like internalized like anti-African or anti-black sentiments. I mean, on a personal level, it would have to be a lot for someone to like say to me that like, oh, like you guys don't consider yourselves Africans or something like that. Like that would take some audacity to do, you know, to say to, in my opinion, to say to something like me up front, like, oh, you guys don't think, like you're making a huge generalization, right? When you don't even know. But online, you see things like that.
Have you seen those conversations online like increase or decrease over the years?
Online is toxic, so I don't.
I mean, I know online is not the real world, but also it is like some sort of reflection of the real world, you know? Mm-hmm. So it's like, so there's a balance.
I would say what I see mostly is that like, is that there's sometimes an elevation of Eritrean and Ethiopian people for two reasons. Sometimes because of its like ancient Christian history, which just because it has an ancient Christian history doesn't mean it's better than any other place. Like I think a lot of times there's a sort of like evaluation of places as being more worthy or less worthy, which is pretty disgusting. And again, like a lot of times centered around white supremacy and like subjugating other Black people and Black and African history, right? Like they're a lot of times only spoken about like, oh, like Eritrea and Ethiopia, particularly Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is more known, but like they speak about like its history as being so much more relevant than Central African Republic, or like what, you know, like all these places have history. It's just that they're not valued in the Western eye as much. And again, like not always explicitly, but like implicitly be like juxtaposed against other African people's history to make us seem superior. And then also the other thing is that when it comes to like, usually with like the so-called Eurocentric features and maybe even in the general, the Horn of Africa, they're women compared to other African people. And so I find that to be really, really insidious, not only throughout the entire continent, but even within the country. Like you see a lot of colorism and things like that. But that's mostly how I see splits and fissures between other parts of the continent and us culturally. And it's in white supremacist interest for that to perpetuate.
But can you speak more about like the features and like what do you see as Habesha features? Like how has this been reflected to you?
What do I consider Habesha features?
Yes.
So I don't consider anything to be Habesha features because I don't acknowledge the term.
Okay, but how have you been socialized to understand Habesha features?
Yeah. You know, like big eyes, big forehead, thin nose, straight-ish, curly-ish hair. Like again, I guess this isn't necessarily from my family. It's just like you're socialized around it, even if it's not like no one's ever explicitly spoken to you about it this way. I never understood it because I always saw many very different looking Eritreans and Ethiopians. Growing up in America, I was taught to sort of focus on skin color. So I focus on skin color maybe more than features compared to other people. But I don't think their features are all that similar, to be honest. Their noses look pretty different to me from what I remember. And so I don't know. I just think a lot of it is just like a load of crap, to be honest. I don't know. I just know that what I hear a lot all the time is that like Eritrean and Ethiopian people are so beautiful. And I do think we're beautiful, but I also think all people are beautiful. And I find it very weird when they always just elevate Eritrean and Ethiopians compared to other people. It's like very bizarre to me. And I think it's impossible to just entangle from thousands of years of propaganda against Black people in general, but Black women specifically. Like there's an idea that we don't look Black and we're able to sort of escape what has been like perpetuated negatively for hundreds of years. And I think the problem with that is a problem in multiple ways. Like one, like it exceptionalizes us compared to the continent. You know, like we have some amazing people, we have some awful people, and like, you know, we have a very unique history just like any place else. So like if that makes us exceptional, it's exceptional only in the sense that like we're unique just like any place is unique. The other problem with it is that like there are tons of Eritreans and Ethiopians who don't fit into the mold that they exceptionalize. That for me is where it's just like you're just like handpicking a certain, when I say you, I mean just like this like very sort of sexist anti-Black society that is like elevating people. And it doesn't have to be white people that are doing that. There can be Black actors who are doing it, but overall the society which has like brainwashed us to look for these certain features and look for these certain physical qualities in people, it stems from white supremacy just because of how power works. But it's pretty gross to me. A story I used to be told was that, and I feel like it was told sort of tongue-in-cheek, like not necessarily like that my family like legitimately believed this, but maybe they did believe it, and maybe they did like feeling that sort of pride and retelling that pride, or retelling these stories as like a sort of expression of pride. And I can even understand that, you know, like if as immigrants and like disconnected from their land, like you want to feel pride and connection in different ways. And also conversations that happen in a private sphere in your family are different than like when you're like, you know, speaking it on a megaphone for like millions of people to hear. But the story like used to be that, okay, like when God was like creating the world, he had an oven, and with this oven he had clay, and like he molded the clay to create the people that he wanted. So like first he molded the clay, and like he turned on the oven and out came African people, but like he put on the oven too much, and like they came out too dark. And so like then he put the clay back into the oven, and he like lowered the like, he lowered the heat. They then came out the clay and like, oh, they were too light, and that was European people. And then like he put the clay back in, he perfected it, and then there were, I even feel when the story was told, like there were Habeshas. I feel like that's what they said actually. I will leave who said it, but it was my family who would tell this story. But mind you, everyone in my family, like my father's side is like very, very dark, and my mother's side is very, very light. So even within the story, like it doesn't even perfectly apply to my family, like, but it's not like they made it up. They obviously heard this from somewhere. So yeah, for me, like we grew up in different eras a little bit, like our age difference is not that much, but I was born in 85, so that is like the height of like the famine and everything that's going on in Ethiopia. And so when I was in elementary school, like people would say, even if they couldn't identify where I was from, people used to say Starvin' Marvin and things like that. Because that was what was like most recently in memory. And like when people thought of Ethiopia, if they had that connection, they would think about like poverty and famine and people dying, which is very different than what people think of Ethiopia now if they think about Ethiopia, but the reference points are just very different. Like the reference point now might be, speaking about like a Habesha girl in a song, like a rap song or like an Afrobeat song. But when I was growing up, it just didn't exist. Like if you knew running, maybe, but like otherwise it was Starvin' Marvin.
I think it's also notable that like in places like DC or LA or Seattle, you do see Amharic, you do see specific communities, and you're starting to see these cities, start to honor these communities or start to just like respond to these communities' needs differently because they do have specific needs. When you think about the word Habesha, which, I know you don't use it, but it is being used, right? And I think at the same time that we're Black, I think this word just notes that we're different. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think similarly like Nigerians or Haitians or any other Black diaspora group should talk about their differences because they do have specific needs. But given all these implications, when we are in a country in the diaspora, like for example, I guess you can speak on America, how do you see our specific needs or community being like represented or the needs being met while at the same time like not causing a division? Or even earlier you said like very definitively like I am Black, right? And the Black identity in the United States is a very unique identity. But then like how does that interact with like your Eritrean identity?
I mean, at times they're distinct, at times they overlap. But like me as an individual, I'm both always at the same time. I mean, as I've grown up, my connection to Eritrea is more like on a political and cultural lens because I'm not physically there. Like when I think about Eritrea, it's like more of like a political and cultural identity. And honestly, even the cultural identity is something that is not as important to me as the political identity. I wish I knew Tigrinya, but I don't speak Tigrinya. I don't speak any other Eritrean language. I don't really like dress in traditional Eritrean way. At a wedding and stuff, it's like fun too, but usually I don't even do that. I don't listen to music. I very much was like raised in America, and I think I had like less exposure to what is typically considered Eritrean culture than most Eritreans in America. But that being said, the way I always connected to Eritrea was like around politics, and that was because my family was always very political. When I think about like the idea of like being Habesha, or like you didn't directly ask this, but like it seems sort of implicit in the question, like spaces for joining or like united fronts with like all other Habeshas or like Eritreans and Ethiopians. That wasn't a reality for me, just because even within the Eritrean community, our community was always divided for the most part. Again, I say for the most part. Like there was a time in the 90s when it wasn't, but I was too young to really like even understand what that was. But even then, like I wasn't. Yeah, it's like okay, you notice when someone is Ethiopian and like you say hello to them, or like you say salam and you have like whatever like exchange with them. But for the most part, most of the places I was in with my family were exclusively Eritrean. And then once the war happened and then the closing of openness in Eritrea in the G15, then I was only around opposition. Only socially it would be like, okay, like Eritreans and Ethiopians, we can come together. But even like at that point, I'm like, all right, like I have no issue with like Sudanese or Somalis or like people from Djibouti like joining in. Like there's all like a similarity, like maybe for a Tigrinya speaking person, that connection would be more with Ethiopia. But if you're an Afar person, well, the Afar Triangle is in Djibouti too, and like there's no reason why you would say like, oh, it's only Eritrea, Ethiopia. Or if you're like Beja or Hidarab, like your connection would be maybe more to Sudan than someone else. So the fact that we're only looking at Eritrea and Ethiopia already is putting, the people who have connections between Eritrea and Ethiopia, like as the more superior ones, or as the ones that matter more. But again, like there are tons of ethnic groups in Eritrea that like would say like, oh, like we're actually much closer to Sudan than we are to Ethiopia. You have ethnic groups in Ethiopia that would say like, oh, we're closer to Somalia, we're closer to Djibouti more than we are to Eritrea. For me, I wouldn't consider them Habesha because like Habesha means a specific thing, but I wouldn't preclude including them in any like union between our peoples. And the other thing is like for many Eritreans, even within my family, like they grew up in Addis and they spoke Amharic. So like obviously there's going to be a connection in some respect that way. Like there were many Eritreans. I mean, Eritrea was part of Ethiopia. It was, you know, like illegally federated, all of that. So like people had to know Amharic. Haile Selassie, you know, like mandated that everyone in Eritrea learn Amharic in school. So like he didn't mandate like, you know, that they were learning like, you know, like Oromo or Somali or something. And so, but even without that, like I feel like the connection in many Tigrinya-speaking Eritreans' minds, there's a connection that exists before that. Even if there's like political divisions and like issues and stereotypes and problems, you know, I think the average Tigrinya-speaking person would say they're culturally closer to an Amhara than to someone from Gambela. But my point is that like, okay, like if you decenter that Tigrinya-speaking person and think from someone who's in the Western Eritrea, like if you're a HABESHA person, like, okay, like, well, what the hell do you care about like Tigrinya and Amhara's connection when you're literally split between Eritrea and Sudan from what might be considered an artificial border, right? So like, that's my only point. And like for me, then it just becomes like if you're looking at all of the hybridity that exists across what's been made like fixed national borders, then it's like, okay, like, yeah, sure, like Eritrea and Ethiopia, like amongst some of maybe like the majority ethnic groups of the country, maybe there's a connection there. But when you look at all other ethnic groups, like, yeah, you can extend to Sudan. Why not extend to Djibouti? Why not extend to Somalia? So on a social level, I have no problem connecting with Ethiopians like that. But for me, it's like, it was always around Eritrea because that was my political identity was most salient for me. And culturally, because of the political divide, all the cultural events would only be opposition people.
Like strictly, you're not.
Well, for the most part, I mean, like, you know, like the barbecue that happened, I was telling you in Harlem last weekend. I'm sure there are people that were maybe pro-government there. It's not, you're not, you know, no one has a scarlet letter on them what they're wearing. You don't know what people are. For the most part, no one's discussing politics. For me, at least, most of my Eritrean interaction comes through either family or in politics. And regardless, that's only opposition. So the sort of cultural influence of someone who is a government supporter is rather limited. Like I wouldn't even know about it.
Well, then, like for your family, it seems like they used it.
Habesha?
Yeah.
Definitely.
So then, like, why do you think that they would feel the need to use that word?
But the thing is, like, I don't think they would never use Habesha to describe someone who wasn't actually Habesha. Is what I'm saying. Like they wouldn't like see an Afar person and call them Habesha.
So they're using it in the very literal.
I think. It's again, I haven't had like an extended conversation with them. My father's also not alive anymore, and he's the one who used to have a lot of these discussions with. But I don't think they would have used it in that sense. Like when they used Habesha, they meant specifically like the ethnic groups that I sort of outlined before. My life is totally different than theirs. Like I was born here, they were born there. Like I don't know. I can't speak to like what the average American is doing, or what the average Eritrean American or the average Eritrean person is doing. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's not. I want to hear your experience.
Yeah, no, I know. But I will say around like the sort of more political question, I don't think the term has anything to do with any of that stuff.
I think it's very political though, because why else would Eritreans be arguing about if they should or shouldn't use the term? Like I said, there's so many conversations that can come from this. Like my hope is that this project will be a catalyst for that, because it's already happening. I think it just needs to be like further recognized, because it can't be like I'm just seeing on asmarino.com at 8 years old, Eritreans arguing. Yeah. I get to high school, I see Oromo people, now Tigrayans, Eritreans are still arguing, and I'm just like, why is it so contentious? And it's because there is that political component to it.
I just think that like, for some people, asserting Eritrea's nationalism is like more important than it is for other people. Like for me, it's not about Eritrean nationalism why I don't use it. I just don't use it because like not every Eritrean's Habesha. It's like why would I use something that like some Eritreans might find problematic? Not because it's about like, oh, like I want to say I'm Eritrean first, but because like literally they're like not a Tigrinya speaker or Tigray speaker, and they're like, why are you lumping me into that group? For me, what's more important is just like that the people who live on that land are able to stay on that land and not risk their lives, you know, to find some sort of happiness and dignity in life. That's all I care about. Like, if one was able to live a dignified life irrespective of what identity they went into, identity would become like much less salient. But identity is important because certain identity groups keep power to themselves and, you know, take it away from others. And they, you know, like they want only their group to come to the top at the expense of others. We see these things as a zero-sum game. You know, in an alternate world in which identity existed, but you respected difference and it wasn't an actual determinant or an input for like a function that would lead to you being successful or not, then who cares what your identity is? Like, I'm a Knicks fan, right? But that doesn't determine whether I'm successful or not in life. Maybe one could argue, like, you know, I've wasted some more time as a Knicks fan compared to like a Bulls. You know, I'm making a joke, but like, it doesn't determine how I end up in life. Being Black does, and therefore I'm much more closer and will fight harder for my Blackness, right, than like my sports identity. I have to go now, sadly.
Yeah, no.
But we can continue this conversation whenever.
No, this was good. I appreciate your time.
Always.